Okay, great. Thanks everyone for sticking around. So my name's Kent Weare. I recently joined Microsoft as a principal program manager lead on the PowerCat team. So that's a Seattle-based engineering group that's focused on strategic engagements with engineering and customers. So I'm Calgary-based, so I'm sticking around here, so you'll see more of me. But today what I wanted to talk about was building a Power Virtual Agents productivity bot. And so this is a solution that's going to leverage Power Automate naturally, and then also we're going to tap into data that is exposed through Graph and the Graph API. Now, just to familiarize those who may not have heard of Power Virtual Agents before, I'm just going to talk a little bit over the next few slides and introduce it. So this is naturally the Power Platform, and we've got the usual suspects. We've got Power BI, Power Apps, and Power Automate. What used to be known as Microsoft Flow has been rebranded. And then we've got this icon on the far right, which is Power Virtual Agents. And much like these other services have democratized access to building reports and dashboards, building apps, and democratizing access to building workflows, we're going to do the same thing, but with conversational bots. So previously, you might have coded a bot using the Azure Bot Framework or some other frameworks that exist out there in the industry. But what we can do today is do that using no code and low code, much like Tyler had referenced. Naturally, these services sit on top of the core platform, which includes our data connectors. So there's over 300 connectors that are available to date. We've got AI Builder, which is used to democratize access to AI solutions. So things like forms processing, computer vision, or even binary prediction. And then lastly, we've got the Common Data Service, which is a data store for building all of these different apps and workflows on top of. Now, when it comes to Power Virtual Agents and building bots, there is no need for infrastructure developers or data scientists. Now, me being previously a developer, I try not to take offense to that statement, but I think the whole point here is that you can actually go ahead and build these things without writing code. And I think ultimately that's a good thing if you think about trying to return value to your company and to be able to do that quickly. Now, the good news is, and we'll talk a little bit about the bot framework in a bit, but we have an extensibility story. So you might have heard of the no cliff strategy, where you can start in these low code environments and then make your way into codeful environments. That principle still applies when we talk about Power Virtual Agents. So we're going to get into the demo where you'll see this in more detail, but you have a canvas that kind of looks like a workflow style application. And what you're doing is really designing your conversation with your customer. And in this case, the customer could be internal or it could be an external customer. And you're naturally going to go through different conditions and prompting them for questions, getting their answers back, and then responding to them. Now, what makes this service powerful is that you're not using things like regular expressions to try to figure out what is the intent of your end user or your customer. We're going to use AI, and we can actually use AI and what's called natural language processing to understand their intent. And that means that I can say, you know, I'm looking to buy a bike, but I could say that many different ways, and it's going to understand it as being, I want to purchase a bike, without having to worry about the specifics. And what is really cool about this service is the extensibility, and it's the extensibility with Power Automate that allows us to tap into all of these different systems that exist through these connectors. So now we're unlocking, you know, over 300 different systems that we can now bring into our bot. And certainly if there's a situation where a connector doesn't exist, we can use a custom connector and leverage it from that perspective. Now, here's the good news. What the Power Virtual Agent service is built on top of, it starts right at the bottom with Azure and Cognitive Services. So we are taking advantage of those services that exist today that developers are using to build their solutions. Then layered on top of Azure, we've got the bot framework, where they're focused on, you know, specific tooling that helps build these conversational apps with end users. And then on top of that is where we have the Power Platform. And really what's happening here is we have this abstraction that sits on top of code. And that's what allows you to go ahead and configure an experience as opposed to having to write a lot of code in order to do this. Now, a few years ago, I wrote a bot using Bot Framework that talked to SAP and talked to ServiceNow. And it was something that I was pretty impressed that I could do so writing some code, talking with logic apps, using logic apps and their connectors to talk to SAP. And it probably took me about 40 hours to go ahead and build something like that. And now with using Power Virtual Agents, I would estimate that that same solution would probably take around 4 hours. So it truly does become transformational when you think about the effort required to build one of these things. And now certainly lowering that barrier of entry, you don't need to have that expertise of someone writing a lot of code, which I think is a great thing if we think about solving problems and solving them quickly and in a sustainable manner. Now, when we do have some of those extensibility scenarios, and I do look at things like from a spectrum, a complexity spectrum, simple things should be simple, and you're going to be able to do that without writing code. More complex things may require code, and that's totally cool. And what you can actually do is take a bot framework skill and actually import it into your Power Virtual Agent. So if you get into a scenario where you can't address your use case using low code, no code, you can write code, get into the bot framework, and then plug that in and basically solve that use case, which I think is pretty cool. And it's really bringing that no code and codeful environments together as required, but still delivering value in a very efficient manner. So now moving with the background out of the way, let's talk more about today's content and the use case. So naturally, there's no shortage of information overload that happens today. Could be coming from your email, your calendar, planners, spreadsheets, you name it. And so when I was thinking about this use case of, always trying to stay on, like to keep on track of all of this information in all of these different repositories, how can I unify these data sources and bring it together? And I thought, well, this would be a good use case for the Power Virtual Agents bot experience. And the sort of secret sauce in all of this is using the Graph API. So those of you who might not be familiar with Graph API, essentially what Microsoft has done is created an API plane on top of Microsoft 365. And this allows you to go ahead and call those APIs and retrieve information about your organization that lives in Microsoft 365. So this could be your calendar info or planner info like we're going to talk about today. It could be people's Exchange usage or their SharePoint usage. We have access to all of that information through that API. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to call that API by using Power Automate, and we'll see some of the out-of-box experiences with how we plug in a bot to Power Automate. And then we'll go ahead and kick off that flow and then provide some level of data manipulation and formatting, and then basically return a clean data set back to our end user. On top of that, there's a few other things we're going to talk about. One is called Markdown, and this is a way where we can format our responses to Power Virtual Agents. So Markdown is a very popular markup language for documenting. So if you go to GitHub and you look at Microsoft's documentation pages, they're all based on Markdown. So we'll learn a little bit about that. We will also go ahead and learn about filtering using OData and the HTTP action. And then we'll also take a quick look at some built-in filtering with Microsoft Power Automate as a result of a bug that I discovered inside of Graph. One thing before we get going, if you try to replicate these scenarios, do note that your flow or your Power Automate flow must be in a solution for Power Virtual Agents to discover it. So that's something just to be aware of. If you go ahead and create a flow and then you go into Power Virtual Agents and trying to find it and can't, chances are it's because you haven't put it in a solution. All right, so the two operations that we're going to go ahead and call are list events, and certainly I'll make this presentation available to everyone after the fact, so don't worry about screenshots or taking notes. But this is essentially coming from the Graph documentation page where we can see exactly what are the type of information that's going to be returned, and just as important, the permissions required inside of Azure, and I'll talk a little bit about that on an upcoming slide. So list events, this is essentially data coming from my calendar, and then the other one is tasks, and these are tasks coming from Planner. And so once again, it's important to note that this is going to come from Planner, not from the Outlook side of the house. Now, security gets a little bit interesting, and I do go through this in a lot more detail on a video on my YouTube channel, so you can go ahead and check that out. But let me just flip over to Azure here momentarily and explain how we're going to go ahead and do this. Now, what we need to do is we need to configure our bot environment to be able to generate tokens for our end users that we can pass into Flow. And we will use these tokens inside of Flow to basically go ahead and call upon Graph. And the whole idea behind this is that we want to be able to use the token of the user that is signed into our bot. So for example, if I'm signed into my bot, we want to ensure that I'm able to access my calendar and my planner tasks and not someone else's. And so in order to facilitate this, we do need to do some plumbing work inside of Power Virtual Agents in order to wire up these scenarios. Now, inside of Azure, there is a construct called app registration. So if you go into your Azure Active Directory service and then you click on app registrations, then we can go ahead and create our own registration. And so here I've gone ahead and created mine. It can be called anything, but there's some information that we're going to need to know, like our client ID, our tenant ID, and we're going to go ahead and create a secret, which is kind of like a password that's going to be hidden here. And then what we need to do is provide API permissions. And when we go ahead and ask for API permissions, what we can do is click on add a permission, and then we'll see commonly used Microsoft APIs. And then there's some other APIs here as well. Now, in our case, we want to go ahead and use Microsoft Graph. And then this is an important decision point as well. There's two modes. There's delegated permissions where you're basically acting on behalf of a user. And then there's application permissions, which would be more like a service account. Now, in both cases here, we can see we're going to use delegated. And much to the point I made before of when I log in, we want to be transacting on behalf of myself. Now, so we would go ahead and click on delegated permissions, and then we could go ahead and click on calendar or type in calendars, and then be able to select calendars.read, and that would allow me to read my own calendar. Now, another nuance that you need to be aware of, and for some folks, this might be a showstopper, and I think it's going to be dependent upon your organization. When it comes to the planner tasks, Planner is leveraging groups, and as a result, the permission needs to be group.read.all. Now, once again, it is delegated, so I can't go see, a group that I don't have access to, or I can't go see someone else's plans, but it does require admin consent. So you could go ahead and create this app registration in Azure, but a tenant admin is going to have to come along and bless you and click on this, grant admin for your tenant, and then that would be lit up. Now, when we head over to Power Virtual Agents, we can go ahead and click on Authentication. And this is where we're going to use all of those values that we've just configured in Azure AD in our configuration experience here. And this is what's going to allow us to establish secure connections to Azure AD and to generate a bearer token that we can actually pass in to our flow. So once again, this is all well documented in this video where I go through that step by step, and you can go ahead and check that out if that's of interest to you. We've talked a little bit about this. This is what gets passed into the flow is this auth token, and this is how we're going to go ahead and call graph, and we're going to do that through the HTTP action, and we need to ensure that we're passing that token so that we can go ahead, in this case, access the planner tasks, and we would do something similar when it comes to calendar. So I will show the flow coming up here shortly, so don't get I'm not skipping anything. We'll get into this in more details. Now, one thing you're going to say, why, when we're in the planners flow, you're going to be asking, okay, Kent, why are you not filtering at source? Filtering at source is always the best approach. Now, when it came down to listing the planner tasks, for some reason, the filter queries don't work. And so I spent probably an hour or two troubleshooting this, trying to figure out why this wouldn't work. I was in Graph Explorer, it wasn't working. I was in Postman, I was in Flow, it wasn't working. And then I did a search and found this, and it explains why. So this is why in Flow, I'm going to actually go ahead and use a filtering action where I can essentially filter out any tasks, planner tasks that are complete, because I don't want those to show up in my bot. So this is what our architecture looks like. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying things, but we've got an end user that's looking to aggregate information and have it at their fingertips, and they're going to retrieve it by using a Power Virtual Agent that will reach out to Power Automate, which will orchestrate all of these calls to Graph, providing some data formatting and manipulation, and then giving response values back to the bot. So I'm going to go and flip over to my demo here, and I will run through the demo first, and then I'll go in and show you all of the inner workings from a flow perspective. Now, what we have here is a single bot, and I'm calling this bot an enterprise productivity bot. And then what you do is you go ahead and create topics. And you can kind of think of these as almost like your themes or your different types of conversations that you want to have with your end user. Here's out of the box ones that you can go ahead and just play with and test out. We've got some system topics that are just these generic sort of conversations that you would have, like a greeting. If someone says good afternoon or hello or good morning, Microsoft's going to figure out that that's a greeting, and it's going to respond in an appropriate manner. Same thing when you want to exit a conversation. Microsoft is building a lot of these out. We can go ahead and enhance them and tweak them if we want. But those are some of the base system topics. Now, I've created 2 of my own custom topics, and one is going to be related to getting my planner tasks, and one will be related to getting my meetings. Now, obviously, this is just a sample tenant or a test tenant. I've got a few meetings listed here, and then same thing from a planner perspective. I've got some tasks that are in flight, like let's see this one here. I'll review my project charter. I've got a task that's done, and then I have a few that are not started. And so what I will be able to do is surface this information through my bot. So I'm going to start off my bot by saying, show me my meetings. And so now what's happening is I'm being prompted to log in. Now, do note that this is in the context of my test harness. When you embed this into Teams, there's some things that we can do to enable SSO right now, but that will be a first-party experience here shortly, where it'll just know that you're logged into Teams and you won't actually have to go through the steps. So this is more of a short-term intermediary step where I have to go ahead and I will authenticate. And in this case, I have already gone through previously and entered my username password. But for this purpose, what's happening is I've already logged in. I've got a token in my browser. So I will get my token, and I'm just going to hit response or hit send. And what's happened now is my token has actually been captured and is stored in this variable called auth token. And this will then get used to be passed into Power Automate. So now, naturally, some people might have 50, 60, 70 meetings in their calendar, and who wants to see those listed in a bot? So I'm just going to indicate how many meetings I'm interested in viewing. Perhaps it's the morning, and I just want to see what my day looks like. So I'm just going to say 8. And what will happen is this parameter will get passed in to my graph call, and it'll return the top 8 meetings. We're also going to filter by date time, and we'll do that in ascending order so I can see what my upcoming meetings are. Now, do note I've got some formatting here. We've got bold for my meeting subject. I've got some italicized font here for the organizer, and then I also have a meeting link. And so these are all examples of Markdown and how we can provide some rich formatting around the communication to our customer. Now, since I have that link, what I can do is drop directly into that calendar, that specific meeting. And so if I was on my mobile, I could go ahead and click that, and I would see exactly more details about the meeting invite that I was interested in. So that's meetings out of the way. Now what I can do is go ahead and just type in tasks. And I'm actually going to spell that incorrectly. And this just speaks to the natural language processing, where it's going to understand that I've just misspelled tasks. And even though it's, I've horribly misspelled it, it's going to figure that out because it's trying to understand my intent and is be able to link me misspelling tasks with, actually wanting to display tasks. So this is similar. I'm just going to show all of my tasks. I can show tasks that are partway started, so I can see the percentage complete. If there's tasks that someone else has assigned to me, I can go ahead and display those. Once again, I'm using Markdown to format the task name and who it was created by, and I will be able to list all of these different tasks that exist. Now, while I'm here, I'm just going to go through and show you what the design experience looks like for these bots or these conversations. So let's just go ahead and click on meetings, and I'll go to the authoring canvas. And once again, this is where I'm going to model my conversation. So I can go ahead and say these are the trigger phrases that I want to kick off my conversation. And so once again, these don't have to match exactly when a customer or an end user is using my bot. It's going to use natural language processing to try to figure out intent. And so in this case, any variations of these sayings is actually going to go ahead and will work for us. Next, I can go ahead and indicate a message. So, that could be a welcome message. And you can do this just by going ahead and saying showing a message. Now, what I've done here, because I want to have an authenticated session, I'm going to go ahead and add an action that's going to prompt for authentication. And provided I'm authenticated, I head down the leftmost path, which means I'm logged in. And then I can go ahead and start asking questions. So for example, in this case, I asked how many meetings would I like to see? And what I'm going to do is specify that I'm expecting a number to be returned. So if as part of that conversation, someone went ahead and just wrote a sentence, it's actually going to say, sorry, I don't understand, because it's actually expecting it to be a number. And so what Microsoft's doing is it's providing a lot of entities out of the box that we can use that is going to basically help us with this, so we don't have to have a lot of custom logic to parse those responses. So we can have like email, language, locations, organizations, and we can even build our own if we want. Another thing, sorry, is there a question?
Can I just do a quick time check, Kent?
Sure.
How many more minutes do you want?
Probably like 5 to 7.
Okay. Just let everyone know.
Okay, and another great thing that you can do is going ahead and using basically some like choices, multiple choices, and that allows you to go ahead and for someone just to click a button as opposed to going ahead and having to type information in. Here's where I go ahead and call my flow. I pass in all of these different parameters, and then I'm going to go ahead and get a response. So I'm going to flip over to flow now, just in the interest of time. Here is my get meetings flow, and what I've done is I've used the Power Virtual Agents trigger. I've included 2 input parameters, and what will happen is that these will now show up on the Power Virtual Agents canvas as basically prompts. And so here's where I've said I need the token, and then also I need the number of meetings that I want to display. Here I'm just basically using a variable that I will append each calendar entry to, and then we'll include that as part of my return value. Here's where I'm going to go ahead and make my graph call. And in this case, here's the graph URL for calendar events. And then here are my query criteria. So I can indicate I want to order my result set by start, date, time, ascending. Here's the number of events I want to show. And then I want to filter based upon anything that is greater than now. I don't want to show meetings that were, in the past. Here, I'll just go ahead and use parse JSON to parse my response, so I have a typed response. And here, I'm going to just basically loop through every entry, go ahead and parse some data like getting the start time, the organizer. I'm going to convert the time into local time because cloud is always in UTC. And then I'm just going to go ahead and append to my calendar events variable. And this is where I'm using Markdown, where I can go ahead and use these double stars to represent bold. And here I'm going to use a single star to represent italics. And then here's where I can go ahead and create a link. And then I will just return that variable back to Power Virtual Agents. And that's how we will display that. Now, very quickly, I will just show you the other flow. This is my tasks. It looks very similar. I'm using a different URL for calling graph, but I don't have any queries because, as I mentioned, it looks like there's a bug there. But what I can do is filter out my result set and look for any of the tasks where the percent completion is less than 100%. And if so, I'm going to go ahead and use a similar pattern where I will loop through and append data to my string variable, and then I will go ahead and return that string back to the Power Virtual Agents client. So that concludes my demos. So if you're interested in these scenarios and want to dive deeper into it, go ahead and check out my YouTube channel. I've got these videos documented there, and then certainly if you're on Twitter, go ahead and follow me at Weare.